the USA Emergency Broadcast Network, your source for reliable disaster preparedness information.
The views and opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily the views of this station, its management, sponsors, or other hosts. If you have any comments or suggestions about this program, please contact us at radio@usaebn.org. That's radio@usaebn.org.
Welcome to the Zeta Report. In partnership with USAEBN, Zeta Talk and the Zeta Report will be discussing the challenges of living on a planet beset with change, rising seas, increasing earthquakes, and volcanic activity, weather gone wild, and the worry of what to do in a worst-case scenario. We will also inject Zeta Talk prophecy on what is coming next and advice on readiness plans and safe locations. Whenever Zeta Talk is quoted, please remember that prophecy is not fact. It is opinion. It only becomes fact when it happens. The Zetas are remarkably accurate, but have been wrong on occasion. Bear that in mind. For more information on this subject, please visit the zetatalk.com website or the Zeta Report on YouTube. Questions from the chat and issues raised in the chat will be addressed toward the end of the hour after the main feature has been presented. Today we want to talk about floodwaters. Katrina Revisited, and more places besides Katrina. Floodwaters bring many dangers: live wires, fires that cannot be extinguished, surprisingly, in the middle of all that water, fires that cannot be extinguished, sewage in the water, eroded foundations toppling buildings, and snakes and crocs suddenly becoming your neighbors. What can we learn from revisiting some of the famous floods in the recent past? Red River. This is a river that runs through North Dakota on its way north, past Winnipeg, into a lake there, and then on, eventually draining into the Hudson Bay. So it doesn't drain into the Mississippi. It drains over very, very flat land, and thus, because of the gradient, it's slow to drain. Well, this can get astonishing. Floods can occur on highland, particularly absent lots of rain. The Red River flows northward through that Red River Valley, which forms the border of Minnesota and North Dakota and the Canadian provinces to the north. It empties into Lake Winnipeg in Canada, which ultimately flows, as I said, to the Hudson Bay. Most of North Dakota is flat land, and during spring melts, when the snow melts quickly, almost the entire state can become one big lake. This has occurred recently in 1997, 2009, and 2011. The major problem is the gradient, the slight slope of the land. In parts of North Dakota, this is as shallow as 1.5 inches per mile. I mean, it's literally flat, level. A second problem is Lake Winnipeg, which drains the Red River. This is a virtually landlocked lake, though it does ultimately drain into the Hudson Bay. If clogged by ice up there, as in the spring melt, or itself flooded, there is a backwash, a failure to drain. Whoops, trapped water. Water everywhere, but not a drop to extinguish a fire. This happened at Grand Forks, North Dakota in 1997. No electricity for the fire department, so the pumps didn't work. And buildings just went up in flames and nobody could do a thing about it. So, lessons learned. What have we learned from the Red River? Even highlands can flood. Fires can occur in the middle of a flood and cannot be stopped. And an inability to drain can create unexpected floods. What do you think, Andre?
Well, I'd just like to jump in. Hi, Nancy. This is Andre from USAEBN. I know that we at USAEBN cover floods this time of year as a regular basis, just because of the spring thaw and then the spring storms that come through. But the Red River is especially problematic just because of the way that it lays on flat land there, and something that a lot of people don't consider when planning for flood preparedness or readiness for floods is that some of the services could be down, such as you were explaining, the fire department or electrical definitely will be down during a flood because it shorts out most everything, knocks down power lines. But then also you got to be prepared for the fire aspect too, shutting off your gas if the floodwaters are coming, getting ready for that, and evacuating the house if you need to, if you do smell gas or anything like that. So just there's more information that we'll cover later in the episode, but that Red River is especially problematic just because of the flat land around it and not a lot of hills or trees or streams to drain it out.
I was astonished when I saw it. It must have been one of these recent years, and the whole state of North Dakota was one big lake, and my jaw just dropped. I said, how can that be? You know, it's way up there in the highlands, and that's the explanation. You know, we had here where I live in central Wisconsin, we have the Baraboo River curling around my little village, and it's we get the spring melt, and yes, the rivers rise. They go over the bridges. You don't dare drive across them. 10, 15, 20, 25 feet up they go. You know, up the water level goes. And the houses that are close to the river, and unless they're sandbagged and they have pumps there, night and day going furiously, their basements get filled with water, and there's a rushing water. You can get swept away in the lake. So we almost became an island. You know, three sides of the village were cut off, and you had this one road that you could go north and make your way up into the hills and then out to other lands. It's kind of scary. I thought, well, we have a little inflatable boat for just this reason, just for peace of mind. Well, let me tell you that I would walk down and talk to these guys that were sandbagging and watching it and tending the pumps and find out what was what. And one thing they said, the first thing they do when the water is rising is throw the main on the house. No electricity. You don't dare have electricity. I'm not sure how far an electrocution situation could, but you know, there it would be, because electricity loves water, and so they turn off all the electricity. And you know, if you have a vast area, they have to keep going up the grid to wherever you know is flooded is off. So you have no electricity. And if you're in the middle of a floodplain like that, you cannot run your pumps. And what are you going to do, throw buckets of water on the fire? Well, just go look at, you know, what happened up there in the Red River to see the whole thing goes up in flames. And this happens a lot after earthquakes too, where fires are started because of sparks or something gets cracked open, you know, like a pilot light or something like that, and a little bit of a gas leak, and the whole city goes up in flames. And they can't. I know that happened when I was in California in 1989, and they had the Loma Prieta, and they had fires, and it was you know, blocks would burn, and they couldn't stop it. You know, they couldn't get the pumps going. Eventually, they did, but it's very scary. Okay, in the opinion of the Zetas, this region draining into Lake Winnipeg will have serious consequences during the coming pole shift. And I quote from a Zeta Talk prediction. And remember, this is an opinion. Winnipeg, Canada enjoys Lake Winnipeg, but during the torrential rains that accompany a pole shift, they will find this a horror. The lake will swell, having no natural drainage, engulfing bordering land. Houseboat living is an answer, as is fishing, which should be increasing along with the waterways. End of the quote. So they say prepare for that if you're a resident around Lake Winnipeg. Okay, Katrina, we got a lot of lessons to learn from that. And I'm sure who can forget the people standing on their roofs waving like crazy, and the fact that George Bush, was playing his guitar at some party on the West Coast at the time. It was like, oh. And good job, Brownie, who was the head of FEMA, but, it wasn't a good job at all. Until General Honore arrived, the Coast Guard guy. Oh, it was like everybody, I breathed a sigh of relief. He picked up some little black girl, carried her around, gave instructions to his troops. It was so darn reassuring. Somebody was in charge. Somebody was going to get those people out of their roofs and, and out of the city and get the food and water distributed and all. So, Katrina, what can we learn from the lessons of the Katrina floods in 2005? Primarily that levees break, even when built by the Army Corps of Engineers, even when considered a part of a flood protection system that was supposed to repel, and I quote, the most severe storm, end quote, that might occur. The levee system had 59 breaches, with the flood wall along the 17th Street Canal the worst. Neighborhoods flooded steadily, the water rising until the old, the poor, and the trapped climbed up in their houses into the attics. I mean, we're talking about little old ladies here. What they couldn't just hop up like a kangaroo to the top of the roof. They kept going up and up, and then they take the little ladder into the attic, and now what? Whoops. Meanwhile, neighbors helped neighbors, chainsaws unleashed to rescue little old ladies from their attics, and anything that floated used to port the disabled and elderly to safety. It was very touching to see, how people rose to the occasion, the neighbors. Not official rescue operations, but just people who got their outboard and got their chainsaws and said, we're not putting up with this, and set off. The establishment, including the U.S. President, the Louisiana governor, and FEMA were late to respond, despite loads of warning that Katrina was aiming for New Orleans, which was almost below sea level, well, I think it is, and protected only by the levees. It was not until the U.S. Coast Guard's General Honore arrived that any sense of rescue from the establishment was evident. I remember there was all this tossing blame back and forth, and the Louisiana governor was supposed to request that the National Guard be activated, and then the president would do it, and unless she requested, and she was a Democrat and he was a Republican, and there was this finger-pointing kind of nonsense that went on. And meanwhile, neighbors had to help neighbors, which they did. One of the lessons learned from Katrina and floods in neighboring Texas in recent years is that snakes and crocs and other such creatures can suddenly become your neighbors. They, too, may be seeking to escape the rising waters. They, too, may use the rising waters as one big highway to your porch. Lessons learned, levees can break. Another lesson, climbing up inside the house can get you trapped in the attic. And the third lesson, snakes and crocs and spiders are more mobile, and they may become your neighbors. And boy, they do. If
you're the island of solace for anything moving, if you're the dry land, they're going to be there. It's going to be rats and snakes and spiders and crocodiles and that sort of thing. One thing I'd like to add on that, Nancy, too, with Katrina and the evacuation process beforehand was assuming that everybody that would be evacuating via highway, right? So that's assuming that all the residents of New Orleans and the surrounding parishes that were under the warning, Mississippi and the rest, were going to be leaving in their own cars. And the people that were left were those, like you said, elderly, poor, not necessarily homeless, but don't have access to a car or a reliable car. And those who waited to get a ride or tried to get on the buses, Nancy, remember? All the highways were clogged. And there weren't enough buses, and then they ended up at the convention center, and then they ended up at the Superdome, and but the one bright spot about Katrina, and we'll go on with more flooding and storms too, in talking about people helping each other, and that's something that that really resonates with a lot of people that read the Zeta Talk message and the Zeta Talk website is that the people that help others, or which are called service to others, it's basically the whole golden rule that's, every religion has. Basically, help do unto others as you would yourself. But you can see examples of this in crisis situations, like you said, the earthquakes and Katrina, and we'll talk about Sandy in a little bit. But people helping others for no other reason than they can and they want to, and not waiting for the government, not waiting for FEMA, not waiting for the locals, not waiting for the fire trucks, doing it because it needs to be done. And I think that's a good thing to take away from some of these situations. It's sometimes it's up to us to take it on and help each other.
Yeah, and exactly. And of course, there's the flip side. All that it brings out in human nature that is not so admirable. Like I can remember there was one roadway that was elevated into, I can't remember where, but it was a more upscale neighborhood, and the sheriff over there and the like, they were pointing guns at people that wanted to leave New Orleans that were poor and black, and saying, thou shalt not pass. And the issue was, well, you're just going to be looting houses. Well, they really just wanted a peanut butter sandwich and a glass of water and to be able to go where all the evacuees did. But they were blocked, and there they were sitting in clumps, with nothing and had to be rescued. I'm not sure how they were rescued eventually. But this is an example of slam the doors, like the Pope said, if you're a Christian, you build bridges. If you're not Christian, you build walls.
The walls.
There was this big snit with Trump and the Pope about that, but this is an example. And then of course looting, where you have opportunistic people who create the myth, or that everybody's just going to loot. Some people will, but not most people. But everybody is treated like a looter and shot on sight if they're just out for a walk or whatever. And there was some of that going on. So you can have examples in both directions. That in these kind of crises, the good and the bad. But I remember the good. I remember seeing those little outboard motors where fishermen who would just go fishing on the weekend and drag it behind their car or whatever. They were out there and they were, rescuing people and getting up on the roofs and with a chainsaw and telling the grandma to stand back and dragging them. It was just wonderful to see. It's so heartwarming, and it doesn't take that much. It's not that much to make a huge difference to other people, to make them feel less abandoned and less hopeless and less frightened. It doesn't take that much. Well, in the opinion of the Zetas, during their predicted pole shift, the Mississippi will be dealing not only with torrential rains, as they mentioned for the Red River, but also a backwash from sloshing in the Gulf. What do they mean by that? Well, the pole shift is, in the opinion of the Zetas, and as geological record shows, where this passing big magnetic planet, Nibiru, shoves the globe to the side, and the plates are moving so fast, and when they stop, they slam into each other, and that's a lot of earthquakes. And meanwhile, water does not necessarily move with the globe. Water has its own, and it stays in place. So it's like if you carry a bowl of soup and you're moving it quickly, the soup is likely to hit your shoe while the bowl moves forward. So same with the Gulf of Mexico. If the globe moves to the northwest because it has been pushed there by a magnetic passing planet, then the Gulf will pile up on Venezuela or over there in the Caribbean, and then it will slosh back. And when it sloshes back, it's going to push back on the water from the Mississippi that is trying to drain, and you get what you call a backwash. So
Can
I quote
clarify
from
one?
Sure.
I'm sorry. I just want to
Go
clarify
ahead.
that when we're talking about the sloshing during and after the pole shift, the water, as the Earth gets pushed, its magnetic poles get pushed by this other larger magnet, Planet X, Nibiru, that we've been talking about that causes this pole shift, what the water is going to seek its own level at all times, as you see with flooding, and you explained with a great analogy of the soup bowl, but also it will go back and forth. So this will continue for several, let's say, days after.
Yes.
Yeah, after the actual shift of the crust happens, and we're start recovering as a planet and as a crust and a core, the water is still going to be going back and forth like a bucket. If you drop it or shake a bucket, it's going to slosh back and forth for a short time until it seeks its own level. So that's what we're talking about with the backwash and the sloshing for this example, for the Mississippi.
Exactly. And anytime you have something backwashing up the Mississippi, then there's all that much more that has to drain. And about the time it gets to moving along and draining, here comes another slosh. So it's not just a momentary thing, hang on for a couple hours and now it's past. It takes days. And quoting the Zetas, the horrific backwash caused by a Mississippi unable to empty into the sloshing Gulf will reach as far inland as Missouri and Kentucky, increasing the flooding along the rivers and drain into the Mississippi. Low-lying states along the Gulf, such as Mississippi and Louisiana, which border the Mississippi where it drains into the Gulf, can expect to be underwater. And this does not mean climb a tree or sit on your roof and hope for the best. It basically means when, in the opinion of the Zetas, when the last weeks are upon us, and you will not be confused about that one at all, because the Earth stops rotating for 5.9 days, for instance, go up into the hills. And anticipate, being underwater, and wait until the sloshing is done and all the draining has occurred.
This goes for pretty much all coastal areas when we're talking about when you see the big changes, you'll know whether or not you read Zeta Talk or not. You'll see the signs in the sky. As a person, if you're looking at these things, it'll hit you in the face. You got to do something. Okay, move past freaking out and get to the action. And the action is get to high ground. And that goes for coastal areas as well as these rivers that we're talking about. Flooding and inundation and sea level rise are kind of all part of this pole shift, and they're eating up countries and land that we're not hearing about because it's not happening to us. So we're just here to help you kind of jumpstart that process. And it's better to have a plan and be prepared than to figure it out on the spot and then get stuck. So please don't get stuck, especially in the attic with Grandma, because she's going to be freaking out because she's in the attic. So
that's really, boy, that was a definite lesson learned. If the waters are rising, just don't go up into the attic, but get out, get on the roof, or get that little inflatable boat out and puff it up with air. Hurricane Sandy, the flooding caused in New York City and along the New Jersey coastline in 2012 showed us what can happen in large cities during flooding, especially since so many of the world's major cities are just at sea level. Sandy was relatively mild as a hurricane, only getting winds of 90 miles per hour from what I read, but the flooding was a shock and a devastation. Now, just to mention how this is so typical, go around the world, and where do people live? Here you have New York City and then down to Miami at sea level, Rio de Janeiro at sea level, Paris at sea level, London, and over on the Pacific Rim, Singapore, Hong Kong, et cetera, et cetera.
Los Angeles?
These major cities, yes. Oh, L.A., Lord, San Francisco. And here we all sit, waiting to get inundated with not much. And as they mention, whenever people talk about, 20-foot rise in the sea level, but there's some of that out there. Yeah, and what are you going to do? The electricity and everything is down there, and this is a big example here. New York City was paralyzed primarily by the need to shut down the electrical stations. Water and electricity just don't mix. Phones, elevators, and lights were not working. Members of the National Guard went door to door delivering meals and supplies to the elderly and disabled. Neighbors helping neighbors and flashlights and groping downstairs where evacuations were required. I remember that. I remember seeing people walk down the absolutely pitch black hallways, helping somebody down and down the stairs. I mean, what else are you going to do? Be on your hands and knees and step on each other, you know? And it was scary. Escalators, elevators, you know, people that are how many floors up and none of this works, and you have to take the stairs and you're not in good shape. Oh. The second shock was the flooded subway and tunnel systems. Water poured into the underground below the cities. Travel in and out of the city was paralyzed, and the subways operating by electricity could not function. Only the Lincoln Tunnel to Manhattan remained open, and that was a way to get off Manhattan Island, which is one big island. Of course, boats, I guess you could use boats, you know, but your people don't think like this. They don't say, evacuate Manhattan. Everybody went up into their apartments. They said, let's just have a party. Where's the wine and cheese and that type of thing? And, you know, how many babies are going to be born 9 months from now, that type of thing. And I do remember people also sitting around, you know, trying to phone somebody. And they had cell phones, and their cell phones needed to be charged. And wherever they had like some sort of a battery charger, there was mobs of people lining up waiting to charge their phones so that they could go down, you know, the block and say, I'm okay, I'm survived, I haven't died, I'm not in the water, I'm not out at sea. Okay, the water from Sandy. When the flood waters swirled around New York City, all manner and pollutants were being spread about. The floodwaters washed things that were never expected to encounter water. You know, how often do you think that your garage floor is going to end up in somebody's drinking water? You say, well, there it sits. You know, and after a while it'll evaporate or blow away and become dust, but you don't think it's going to be in the drinking water. Where floodwaters usually involve mixing sewage in with the rainwater and ocean surge, sewage at least is biodegradable. What was sloshing around under New York City was anything but clean, and it wasn't sewage. It looked awful. It had all kinds of colors and
weird colors. Like
reddish,
that shimmery petroleum sheen, but nastier because it has raw sewage and then the photos
Lord
are on
knows.
those. Right.
Yeah, bug killers. Who knows? Eventually, this flows to the oceans, affecting the ecosystem and food supply. But the bottom line is it's not clean water. Another thing about the underground, you know, the subways and the like, if you see the city, what you see is above ground. And I may be overstating, but I think for every level you see up, there's a level down. And they have, the plumbing is down there, the electrical system is down there, you know, the sewage and drawing water in particular, all the electrical trunks and the like, gas for gas heating, all that is in the underground, and all of that can be affected by water, which it's not supposed to be. It's never supposed to be exposed to water, and then it rusts. You know, and then even afterwards you have all this stuff that's rusting away because it got exposed to, salt water is corrosive for one thing.
Right.
So it's a huge problem. If your city is going to be flooded like that, you know, it will probably never be the same, and you shouldn't be living there anyway. You should be in the country having chickens and goats and gardens. So
have your wine and cheese in the wilderness. That's the lesson here. Well, it kind of is. I mean, when you think about it, the reason why, I just want to point out that Sandy especially is one of the main reasons why USA Emergency Broadcasting Network came into being, because some of our members were on that in that area in the Northeast during this time, and had the ability to have a laptop with a good connection, a cell phone with a good connection, and power, and we were able to relay help and different information at that time. Kind of after that, realizing that some parts of the government weren't quite quick enough to help out with that, so that's why we as a network have been doing this for over 4 years now is to talk about the preparedness part of all of this, not necessarily the doom and gloom, and that's why we brought in Nancy and the Zeta Talk opinions, is to help get your mindset ready for this could happen to you, not just New York City, but it could happen in Miami. It could happen in, Texas, in the Gulf area, as it has happened before with hurricanes. But think about where you're at and what your location is and what could happen, and then plan for the worst. And a lot of this stuff will be easier as it comes along. But I just, Sandy in particular with the salt water in the subterranean, New York City is built on bedrock, which is good for the buildings, but bad for drainage. So when the seawater gets in there, it has to be pumped out. And even if it does evaporate, it's going to take years to evaporate from a subway tunnel. So that's part of the infrastructure that gets literally destroyed when, we get this inundation. And, we're seeing some of that in other areas too, which we'll touch on, that it's coming. You just plan on it.
Exactly, and I mean, they keep warning us about the 20-foot rise. If the poles melt and Greenland melts, that's a 200-foot rise. So look at all the talk about the melting Arctic, blah blah blah. And the glaciers melting. So they're just creeping. Now they say, oh, it's another 0.2 inch. I mean, but they're warning us that it can be a lot more and fast. Okay, once again, the rule about fires raging out of control during floods proves true. A fire at Breezy Point in Queens was sparked by trees coming down on wires, trees coming down on transformers blowing up, and the wires going into the water. But the largest example was along the New Jersey coastline, where an entire neighborhood was aflame. It takes but a spark. So the lessons learned from Sandy are cities at sea level are highly vulnerable during storms and sloshing, and they're all on the ocean, and the ocean will slosh. A city paralyzed by lack of electricity is more than just dark, so much. The elevators don't work, and the escalators, the phones don't work, the lights. And another lesson learned, a flood fire in a city is an unstoppable force. It stops when finally the flames flicking up into the air and the sparks can't find anything that will burn. Right, it burns out. And if that can be in a row houses, the whole city, or the whole. It's really, this can happen. And there are some of the older earthquakes way back, like I think the 1906 in San Francisco, there was just huge, vast areas of the city that burned in a similar manner, to this. In the opinion of the Zetas, during their predicted pole shift and their predicted rise in sea level in the aftertime, they, and I quote, make a list of the cities that would be affected by only a slight increase in sea level. Paris, London, St. Petersburg, New York, Miami, Buenos Aires, Los Angeles, Sydney, and Hong Kong, to name just a few. Mankind has estimated that sea level will rise 200 feet if the ice on the poles and Greenland melt. And this appears to be in process. Parts of New York City begin getting flooded at 10 to 20 feet. That's what happened with Sandy. It didn't take much. Mm-hmm. And the entire city area will be underwater at 100 feet. And what happened was, once it got to a certain level, like the 10 to 20 feet, it poured into the underground, which was this vast, cave under the city. And then there was no end to the salt water rushing down there. Wow. Yeah, I remember that they evacuated. I think it was the mayor said certain parts of the city were going to evacuate, and there were people that were fussing. Oh, come on. Don't do that.
We can't. Can't you fix it?
Yeah, we have a Broadway show.
Right. I will say, though, some of the reports coming from on-the-ground families that I've heard and that we have heard from the network too during Sandy and especially the immediately afterwards when the storm ended, there was still the flooding and still no infrastructure for quite a while. some of the recommendations coming over the airwaves, in New York were batteries and water. Just grab some water and some batteries. Okay.
Yep.
That's your recommendation, is waters and batteries. So you can't eat either, and you got plenty of water outside. So, sometimes you have to use a little bit of common sense. It's like maybe a little bit more than the minimum this time. If this is going to happen again, we're getting these 100-year storms every 6 months.
Every year.
Right.
Right.
Figure it out.
Isn't it true? Hello. Right.
Mm.
All right, I'm going to hop outside the North American continent now and go to Indonesia, because what I want to talk about has not really happened here. We had people wandering around in Katrina in the dirty floodwaters and the like, and there was, what about cholera, what about this and that, but people rushed in, and made sure there was clean water and food and that type of thing in a fast enough manner that some of the after effects from flooding did not materialize. But that's not true in third world countries. And if you have a flood and you don't get rescued for quite a long time, this kind of stuff can happen to you too. So in Indonesia, has been sinking the Sunda Plate. For those who don't know what that is, it's where Sumatra and Java are, and it curls around to New Guinea and then up toward the Philippines, etc. It looks like a lob or a tongue, coming down off of the Eurasian plate. That is a platelet, but it is attached to the Eurasian plate. It's called the Sunda Plate, and it is being pushed down because the plate that India and Australia ride on is tilting and shoving under the Himalayas. That's why the Himalayas are so high, even though they have things like seashells in the rock up there, way up there at the top. And this kind of process is ongoing and palpable, and they have the quakes, and India's having problems with the sea level rising, in Sri Lanka and along their coastline. And no, this isn't sea level rising because water would seek its level. If this were happening, then Africa would be experiencing this too, and they are not. So the east coast of Australia is finding they are pulling up out of the water a little bit, and India is finding they're going down. So this process basically has trapped Sumatra and Java so that they get shoved down as this tilting and the like happens. And the Zetas predicted ahead of 2011 that, like around Jakarta, would lose 80 feet of elevation, and as you go up toward Bangkok, it would be more like perhaps 40 feet and the like. And this kind of an elevation drop did happen in 2011, 12, 13, blah, 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 blah. For instance, in Jakarta, they had to, build the dikes up. Sandbagging wasn't enough. Pumping the seawater out wasn't enough. And the recent mayor of Jakarta has come out and said they're going to have to relocate the entire city to the island of Borneo, as an admission that they're sinking. But the excuse given is, we've had a lot of rain, and they pumped water out of the underground, and the ground is thus sinking. Except that it's sinking all over the place, and it's not the rain, which they like to point to, because the people that were growing crops, along the coastlines in these areas that were completely inundated, said it is seawater. They have inundations from the seawater, and that's not from the rain. So, bottom line, they had a lot of flooding, and eventually they got people relocated out of these areas. But in the meanwhile, they would wander around wading in the water. School children would slosh to school. Most of their buildings were up on stilts a bit, and they would get so much exposure to all this flood water where things can grow, and not just mosquitoes either, and they got sick. They would get an itchy kind of a skin rash thing. Well, let me read. Where floodwaters come quickly and recede, the diseases caused by floodwaters seem imperceptible. but some floods, and most in our future, may linger. We can look to what happened in Indonesia in 2011 when the Zetas predicted sinking of lands on the Sunda Plate, and this began occurring. The reality of this sinking was suppressed in the news, but in 2011, the sinking was obvious in photos taken by airplane, and I'm going to show some of this stuff in my YouTube. It is astonishing what you could see, from airplane. And for a while, you could see this on MODIS, the satellite, but then they stopped that, and they started using older images of the land so that it appeared there was no flooding whatsoever. A huge cover-up going on about all of this. Okay, comparing MODIS satellite images to what would be expected with an elevation loss, one can see that exactly 20 feet of elevation loss had occurred in Java by early 2011, and this pace continued. The flooding did not remit. Residents eventually relocated, reporting that the floodwaters were caused by inundations from the sea. Jakarta was particularly telling, with floodwaters in the main streets around the central square. Pumps were installed, dikes strengthened, with expertise from the Netherlands called in to recommend improvements to the dike systems. Eventually, the new mayor of Jakarta stated that the city, the capital of Indonesia, would have to be eventually relocated to the island of Borneo, and that was in print. The big lesson he learned here is what can happen if a populace is forced to live in waters for long periods of time, wading about or swimming in infected or polluted waters. Indonesia was a huge lesson in that regard, even though the kids had fun in the big, dirty swimming pool. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid are waterborne diseases. In Indonesia, mosquito-borne viral diseases like dengue and chikungunya fever became rampant. And leptospirosis, which is spread through the urine of rats. Their habitat was destroyed by the floods, and anyone with open wounds who came into contact with contaminated water got infected. And it was a mess. They were, it was like, get the kids out of the water, and this medicine and that medicine and a shot of this and a shot of that, and it was, it just wasn't mosquito bites. It was serious stuff.
Yes.
So
yeah, any open wounds or cuts or anything of that nature when you're walking around it's basically you're walking around in a cesspool, let's just be honest, and you can get infections very quickly, and weird infections that you normally wouldn't see without these kind of inundations, because like you said, the rats and the dead animals and bodies and polluted and chemicals.
Yeah, these guys didn't come into contact with rat urine. They would be out in the jungle. They would be running along the riverbanks or wherever, but how would you come in contact with rat urine? Yeah, washing over your skin. You wouldn't, but it's in the water. As the floodwaters rise, the rat goes up the tree, and everywhere that they peed, that poison, or that, I guess it was a virus, leptospirosis, sounds like a bacteria, doesn't it? Yes. That and they had these infections. They had skin infections. I just remember it was really dramatic, and yet you'd see these pictures of the kids jumping off the porches of their houses, which were on stilts. Whee! One
right into the water.
Swimming pool. Oh, they had so much fun.
Keep your mouth closed. Keep everything closed. Oh, yeah. Nancy, one quick question about the Jakarta, the mayor story about the relocation.
Yes.
I know we don't, here in the United States, we don't get a lot of information through the news media on, let's say Indonesia, perhaps, but wouldn't this be more of a news topic? We're moving a major city from, one island to another, a capital city.
Well, they're not moving yet. They're not moving yet. He came out with that. But the media the media absolutely is under orders not to stress that we have these serious earth changes going on. Wait, now we're going to move. Now we're going to move into something that went on in the West Coast, and was visible from NASA and GEOS satellites. And the cover-up is, it's palpable. People are seeing this approaching Nibiru, and they see it in sunrise and sunset, occasional second sun sightings. We just had something this week, which is in the new Zeta talk, about a Brazil video, which is such a dramatic capture of Nibiru on the left-hand side of the sun, which is where you see it when you're in the southern hemisphere. It's a distinct orb with this huge glow. It will have its own reflection on the water in these instances. It's undeniable that, the amount of evidence, hundreds and hundreds of instances where I can show you that it's been captured, and I've documented it on my websites, and yet not a word of this in the media. Oh, no, we don't. No. If anything weird happens, it's the sun must have burped, or, whatever. Yeah. So in any case, the lessons learned from Indonesia is desalination units for drinking water must be considered during seawater incursions. That was something. They didn't have enough. And what were they going to do? Drink salty water? Well, I don't have to tell you what that's going to do to your body. You do not survive if you're drinking nothing but salt water, So they could have installed desalination units, and then they would have had pure drinking water, but no. All this, no, this isn't happening. We are not sinking. There isn't seawater incursions. And the other lesson learned, constant waiting about in floodwaters opens a path to infection. Yes.
That's for sure.
So what common sense precautions can the public take? I wrote down some. One is mine, have an inflatable boat with paddles.
Just
Since that day we were almost an island, I have one of those, even though we're high. But you never know, Have bottled water, or at a minimum some bleach to purify drinking water, a drop of bleach or two. Then this is not the ultimate, but at least it will kill little wriggly things in there, and you can set it out and the bleach blows away in the air, and then you can drink it, Turn off the electricity in the event of a flood at the breaker boxes or higher, however high you have to go. Prepare for houseboat living in the event of a long-term flood. And that's my takeaways.
Another lesson from that, not just in Indonesia, but also with the what's called brackish water. It's a mixing of seawater and fresh water, and it happens a lot in deltas. But when we have this inundation, it's mostly seawater that, like you said, that comes in and mixes with everything. And not only does it destroy infrastructure, but it also will, get into the sewer system and then into, your water plants and your drinking water supply at that time too. And you think about your electricity being out for the city, there's no pumps to pump the water from the clean water plant. Let's say that that's actually working, that there is clean water there. There's no pumps to get it to you at the faucet. So water is one of the main things that we keep really at the front of our preparedness checklist. You can live much longer without food than you can without water. It's things about 3 days and water. Salty water doesn't do it. And if you're going to be taking in infected water with all these bugs in it, the least you can do is put a couple of drops of bleach into it, let that air out, and it won't have the bacteria and bugs in there, but there'll still be chemicals.
Right.
And as we can see from our last show, we touched on Flint, and that's still not fixed up there, and it's not going to be fixed for quite some time.
That's right. Do you know if they would boil their water and distill it in Flint, they would have no lead in their water? Because you do not have lead traveling in steam and condensing and dripping down. It stays in the stuff that's boiling away down there, the base water. It gets rid of heavy metals, kills the little bugs, and, really my takeaways is blah, blah with a drop of bleach, or better yet, for long term, be prepared to distill your drinking water. It gets rid of everything. It's pure, and it's a little effort, but boy, in the long run, aren't you going to be ahead of the game? Yeah.
Right. No matter what kind of filtration system you have, or if you have bottled water that is from a good source, then you're good there. But as far as making clean, pure, fresh water, a recommendation from USAEBN and from Nancy at Zeta Talk is distillation is the best way. You make sure you get rid of all your heavy metal contaminants, all of your chemicals, and all of the bugs are killed. They will not travel in steam. The heavy metals won't travel in steam. The steam then condenses and goes into another clean container, and that's your distilled water. One thing about distilled water, though, when you distill it, you're taking the air out of it as well. So as it goes through the process of steam and then condensing back into pure H2O, there's no air in the water anymore. So, put a cap on the bottle, shake it up vigorously, really fast to give it that. It's going to feel weird in your mouth if you're drinking pure distilled water that's just been sitting there. You know what I'm talking about, Nancy. It's kind of strange.
Yeah, exactly. Good spring.
It just feels differently.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with it. It just doesn't have any buoyancy to it, any air. So you can just shake up the bottle.
It's flat. It has a flat taste.
Flat.
Right. Yeah.
But it's clean, and it's clean because it's been boiled and turned into steam. So there's nothing left. You'll notice in the bottom of your pot that you're doing the boiling, whatever you have, that you'll have sediment in there, and it won't be pretty.
That's right. Toss it out. Right. Yeah. Isn't that the truth? And Andre and I wanted to touch on what happened recently on February 25th on the West Coast. And you may not have heard this because it did not hit the evening news, although it pretty much went viral on the Internet. And on the West Coast, after a week, there was a TV station, CB something, that had to address the issue because people were very concerned. Now, what I noticed, and what was being reported was it was like into Mexico, down below Tijuana, all up along the West Coast, and it's just not coastline. It was inland by a full couple of states, California and Nevada and Arizona, and up through Utah, up all the way over to Montana, and up past Vancouver Island. It was a huge swath, and I found when I did some
Alberta, Canada as well.
Alberta up there, and I found that it matched something where people were saying from the satellite you can tell where there is potential volcanic whatever. This whole area had little dots in it, not where current volcanoes, but that there it also can be stuff underground, lava. In other words, that is an area that could be affected by release of fumes from magma moving about. Okay. So the big scream was, carbon monoxide. We're not talking about dioxide. Monoxide, which is the stuff that kills you in your sleep. And people were reporting that they were feeling sleepy and that their skin was turning bright red, which is a clear sign. I mean, unless they were just all making it up and we're talking mass hysteria, but this was enough of a press with people with each other on the Internet. And these images of the emissions were being taken by the satellites, which included GEOS, NASA, and then there was one other, I forget what it was. But these were a conglomeration of data inputs from 3 different satellites. And there are people who watch this stuff all the time. It's amazing. Whatever the government puts out, there's somebody who kind of monitors it. Looking at it and keeping track and seeing what this is telling us, especially because there's earthquakes up and down along the West Coast, San Andreas and the like, and volcanoes like Mount St. Helens, and they may be looking for, are we getting and now these gases, it wasn't just this carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, CO2, but also sulfuric dioxide, SO2 also, and these 3 are all emissions that happen from volcanoes. So people are saying, wow,
right, magma.
we're going to have a volcanic, but this huge whole area. So people were panicking, And now I'm going to explain to you what the Zetas have to say about all that. But Superstation 95, which is a website, was reporting on this, and I just want to quote from that. Carbon monoxide spikes were 27,000, where the usual is only 150 on the West Coast. Scientists are working feverishly to try to determine the cause, but they say a consensus is quickly developing. The Earth itself is emitting this gas, and it is being released into the atmosphere via seismic fault lines, cracks in the Earth's surface where tectonic plates rub together. It is completely unprecedented. Now, end of the quote. 27,000, where 150, that's 180 times more than usual. Whew. So a week later, on March 3rd, NASA cobbled together their anticipated excuse, but they didn't give a lot of information. This was a TV station that lingered on everything else and just sort of threw it out there in passing. NASA says it was a satellite glitch, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
We get no data. What kind of a glitch? What exactly happened? How did you fix the glitch? Will it recur? Whatever. And I think you said to me, Andre, that now the public is being suppressed from having access to those satellites. So the feed from those satellites is now, good luck trying to get it, huh?
Well, that's the thing is there's a lot of amateur seismologists and amateur astronomers out there with the power of the internet. You can pretty much get to or look at most public documents, and this was just an example of somebody that found out that the weather patterns from this satellite can be overlapped onto the GOES satellite that measures gas emissions, and all of a sudden we see this big spike all the way up the fault areas of California, and then a little skip through northern Nevada and then Pacific Northwest, where, by the way, we're coming up on Cascadia Rising, which is a drill in the Pacific Northwest for the Cascade Fault and the Juan de Fuca Plate to make their big movement and have the tsunami that's coming up in June. So,
right.
They're trying to get prepared and push down information at the same time. But with the information that came off of these satellite feeds, is that the plume goes up and then dissipates over with wind patterns over the plain states and then doesn't occur again. So if it's a glitch in the system and it was an anomaly from that particular day, the 25th or 26th of February, then the next 3 or 4 days it dissipates over the remainder of the country with the jet stream. I just don't understand. These are precursor gases that are known to be released around volcanoes and magma.
Right.
This should be a sign for people to get ready, but instead the government
and be prepared prepared for what's coming. Right.
Yeah.
And the Zetas have stressed that the North American continent is being pulled into a bow shape, as the Atlantic pulls apart, the tip of Mexico is pushed into the Pacific, and why doesn't it just roll? The plate rolls like Africa and South America are rolling. It can't. It has a flat top. If you look from above the Arctic, you go, from Japan all the way over to Iceland, one straight line. It has a flat top. It cannot roll. So there's this bowing stress where the Aleutian and the tip of Mexico are being pulled kind of toward each other. Meanwhile, right in the center where all this happens, San Diego, LA, in the center of this, that's the center of the bow. So it's stressful. It causes cracks, crevasses, breaking water and gas mains in San Diego, and etc., and it opens up the Earth. So the gases being emitted and recorded are also typical for a volcano, and as I mentioned, it exactly. I'll have that in my YouTube follow-up of this on the Zeta report. You can see how the areas that were darkened by CO and the areas that were highlighted for some sort of volcanic activity underneath are identical. Another example of stress at the Bow Center is the Porter Ranch drama near LA. If you've been following that for several months last fall, Commercial natural gas is collected from the Porter Ranch area, and methane gas is naturally present in the mix due to what is being called a broken pipe, down there where they collect the natural gas coming up. Both gases, methane and natural gas, are spewing in abundance, driving the residents in the area to vacate. Methane gas, after all, smells like rotten eggs. Per the Zetas,
Right.
Porter Ranch problems are also attributed to that North American bow stress. It's right there in L.A. And this is only going to get worse, and it did. After they predicted that it would get worse, it did. Well, here's the thing. You got a lot of natural gas in the up and down the coast, and this is because when you have subducting plates, you get vegetation trapped between rock layers, and methane gas is produced without oxygen by bacteria, etc., that don't require oxygen, and it is very explosive. So you have a lot of this stuff, and we're having methane. They say, well, what is that light tower? Some of these light towers are very dramatic, and it is methane hissing out of the ground, being lit up by lightning or some such, and boom, it's gone. But it's like, what was it? Somebody turn on a giant flashlight and then turn it off? It's like that. So the West Coast is worrisome. You guys should be prepared not only for sloshing in from the Pacific, but this kind of activity, and get up into the hills. When you get to the last weeks, move. And that's the end of my lecture.
Well, thanks, Nancy. That's really extensive. I know we covered a lot of topics here on this episode, but really it's all about the same thing. There's a lot of earth changes going on. They're piling up. Literally, plates are piling up on top of each other. And we're just trying to get the word out of how to be prepared for it and how to watch for it, so you know when to get prepared. And like you said, high ground is a good place to be, and away from the coast. And some of those, the CO emissions and plume and the outgassing that we were talking about, a lot of those were coming from inland parts of California and western Nevada and western New Mexico. Those are dormant and extinct volcanoes, and now just dormant, but not so dormant anymore. If you look at the earthquakes that are coinciding in some of those areas, you can see that there's movement in those areas too. So you've got movement, you've got outgassing. How much more do you need? The actual earth to open up, and that's happening in areas too. So
yeah, just
be aware
of
what's around you.
Exactly. And in the opinion of the Zetas, Yellowstone will not become a supervolcano. It will become an oozer like Hawaii. It'll be a normal volcano, 100 miles away from it for the ash, blah, blah. So no supervolcano, and the Zetas are highly accurate in their predictions.
Well, thanks, Nancy. Another great information-filled episode. You want to check out more about this, you can check out zetatalk.com or the sister site. Nancy has another blog site called PoleShift, one word, poleshift.ning.com. Yeah. And that's where the Zetas actually ask questions. If you submit a question, it gets on there, and it will be answered by the Zetas. So appreciate that as well.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank USAEBN for the opportunity to get this out.
Excellent. We'll be looking forward to the YouTube of this on the Zeta Report on YouTube, which will just add even more information and pictures as well as video. And that's Zeta Report on YouTube. Check out usaebn.org for more preparedness information.